The incredible monument the motherland calls, in the great city of Volgograd, in Russia. A monument that stands nearly 280 feet tall, completed in the 1960s to commemorate the Great Battle of World War II. Volgograd, another one of those intriguing cities that's technically within Europe, and I'm always amazed at how oftentimes we overlook the fact that much of Russia, the western portion of it, is in Europe. There are many interesting questions about the construction of this impressive monument. It happened no doubt in the 1960s, and yet there's many mysteries behind this city, and these other cities within Russia. Today we're going to explore these interesting questions. You might know Volgograd by another name, Stalingrad, where the largest battle of World War II occurred, and some say the largest battle in the history of the land. Over 1 million lives ended in the battle. Some accounts say as many as 3 million lives. When we examine the history of Russia, we think that it has more of an innate desire to preserve its old world structures, and it even has the same questionable construction behind certain structures, such as the University of Moscow building. Many mysteries to be found in Russia, and yet in many ways they mirror the mysteries that we've come across in other portions of the land, whether we're exploring locations in North America, South America, Australia, Asia, of course the part of Russia that's not in Asia, and Africa, which we'll begin exploring very shortly. But I wanted to focus on Russia because there seems to be an interesting origin point for perhaps the remnants of the civilization that preceded ours, which has been removed from the records. I also managed to acquire a lot more interesting footage that gives us a better idea of what places such as Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Volgograd look like in Russia. We've explored these cities before in the past, but I wanted to take a little bit of a closer look. And I also wanted to ask some more important questions about the concept, the premise of a great mud flood actually occurring here in Russia in the distant past. Russia does have an interesting history. And if you were brought up in any one of the so-called Western nations, there was a very definitive identity that was accompanied with your understanding of what Russia, or the Soviet Union, as the government that ruled Russia during the main time frame of the 20th century, specifically from after the Red Revolution or the October Revolution up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, ostensibly. Although it should be noted that the Soviet Union lasted a few years longer, until the complete collapse, depending on which version of history we're going with. And yes, it is intriguing to think that in this era of the Soviet government, which comprised most of the 20th century, we had incredible structures such as this that were built. And yet when we look at the history behind many of these structures, we find that it does seem to mirror the history that we have for the similar structures across the so-called Western world. Although that's the other interesting part about the existence of Russia and these structures, because so many of them seem to have survived, and not only have they survived, but they've also survived intact. There's also that everlasting question that we have about what the true origin of a lot of these sculptures, these monuments, really happens to be. Is this actually a structure from our particular civilization, or was it constructed by another civilization? Or is the history as we understand it complete and intact, and there's no reason to question it? Many people will tell you that there are no mysteries, that everything is very easily and well documented. And yet I would counter that with a place such as Russia, and then of course in the Soviet Union, we have the same conflicting accounts that we do, especially in places such as the United States. And really that's the part I find most intriguing. Also the concept of how we identify many of these areas, these national boundaries, but not just the national boundaries that we have, but also the boundaries between the continents. There seems to be some interesting connection and correlation between many of the structures that we explore. And I don't think I have to tell frequent viewers of this channel, and a welcome to all new viewers, that we see impressive structures like this all across the land. And they share what we're informed are Roman Greco construction features. Yes, that architectural style that just seems to be all across the land. And yet you'll find some of the most impressive structures in places such as Moscow and St. Petersburg in Russia. And even to this day, though, Russia continues to be a mystery for many reasons. Again, looking at the origin of many of these monuments. I always found one of the most unique connections between Russia and the United States the whole concept of the Order of St. George. It's based on the old myth of St. George slaying the dragon. And we're well aware of the myth and the legend, and of course the respective orders that exist in both Russia today and the United States, especially the United States Army, where the Order of St. George is the order for the Association of the United States Army Armor, or tanks. What's the real origin behind this legend, though? Is there a completely different story that we're not aware? Is St. George slaying the dragon that's commemorated here in Russia something that tells a completely different story, a different battle? And then, of course, looking in the interior of many of these incredible structures, this incredible and remarkable theater that defies all explanation, something that no one could build today, or at least no one would attempt to build today. Not because we lack the capability, but simply because it wouldn't be cost effective. Or a structure such as this. Could you imagine approaching some contractor anywhere in the land, Russia, China, the United States, and asking them to build a structure such as this? Now, I'm sure there are people out there that will say that yes, of course, it's possible with the right amount of financing and the right amount of time. What I always find interesting, though, is that the preponderance of these structures were constructed during a time frame before the advent of heavy machinery. The official historical explanation, especially in certain areas in Russia, is that there was a vast amount of human labor that was employed. And that may be the explanation, but when you look at the beauty behind these structures, when you see the artistic creativity and the geometric precision, and also the scale of construction, for example, the completeness of the columns, and we've seen these construction details in other locations across the land, it seems as though we have a very different picture to paint of this particular area. I'll admit in my explorations of Russia, what I'm most impressed by is they do seem to have retained the very genuine nature behind many of these old world structures, or that they haven't altered them as much as they've been altered in other places, such as the United States. There's also the usual combination that we have of unique compounds, or a collection of structures that seem to represent old world buildings that have survived a previous reset event. And yet we'll see the same kind of patterns, the same sort of layouts, and perhaps we can even speculate or posit the same theory for what purpose all of these unique compounds may have actually served. Were these structures that were purpose-built to survive the reset? What's the real purpose behind all of these domes? And why do we have the exact same sort of layout in these structures behind the land? How can you actually reconcile this with our official history? Are we to believe that all of these vastly differing nations with their different ideologies managed to share an architectural detailed knowledge across their borders and across their many differences? Or is it possible that there really was no sharing that was required, because originally they represented the same civilization? So many different questions, and to even ask them can offend many people, because many people are offended and frightened by simply asking questions, even though no offense is intended. I certainly don't mean to denigrate the people of the United States or the people of Russia, and I do concede it may be possible. And we even see the same modern inclinations in Russia with the current, what we would obviously classify as Fifth Era constructions. Tall towers of steel and glass. And whether it's Moscow or New York City, we see the same details behind them. And then we even see certain projects of renovation on some old world structures. But for whatever reason, whatever series of explanations that we can come up with, it appears that the old world structures and many of the layouts do survive entirely intact in Russia. And that very fact alone makes us an area that's worth our consideration, and our attempts to understand and explain exactly what the origin behind these structures and their original purpose really was. But you look at some of the layouts and you'll see that it does match some of the finest cities across what we would consider Western Europe. For example, many parts of St. Petersburg, in my humble opinion, rival the great cities of Venice and Pisa. But even the interiors, where we see the same immense construction. Looking overall, though, at Russia, I wanted to take a look at the good old Urbano Monte map from the 1500s, and I always want to take an excuse to take a look at this map. Let's really define the difference between Europe and Asia, or Europa and Asia. And we can see an odd assortment here. Remember that this was a map that was created by an Italian map maker in the 1500s. And we see Greenland here that's very curiously oriented more west to east. And then, of course, the usual phenomenon of land up in the Arctic or the North Pole, where we understand there to be no land but only ice to this day. We could perhaps explain that, but why is Italy, the origin of the map maker himself, so misoriented, as though it's pulled back further, and again more oriented west to east? Was that just a mistake? And then as we proceed east, trying to really understand this dividing line. As I said, many people oftentimes mistake the fact that all of Russia is considered Asia, which is not true. Western Russia, to include the great cities of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Volgograd, are all very definitively in Europe, the continent of Europe, even if they're not part of the political entity such as the European Union. Why is it that this mountain range of the Urals is actually a dividing line between continents? And what sort of great wonders actually exist on the east side of the Urals, or the great land of Siberia? And I've always found it very interesting that historically, the Russian exploration to the east seemed to mirror the exploration to the west in the United States, even if officially it didn't happen at the same time. Mare Tartaro. And yes, on the older maps we'll see numerous references, and even the name itself, Tartaria, Greater Tartary, and the other different variations. We also see unicorns drawn on this. Why would someone such as Urbano Monte draw these fantastic creatures? Was there a giant lizard-like sphinx creature that roamed the land and devoured unfortunate individuals? Were there devil creatures in what we may think of today as Mongolia or northwest China? There's so many different accounts behind all this, and yet we understand this to be one of the very first and most accurate maps of the land. All these connections and all this focus on what is today Russia, and then of course even China. Certain areas look rather fantastic. Ah yes, that looks like Japan. Is this the Japans, asks Anjin-san. Well, it doesn't look like the Japans, it seems like it's oriented very differently. And then of course the very incredible Strait of Anian, which today corresponds with the Bering Strait between Alaska and Siberia. And then just going a little further to the east, looking at the west coast of what is today the United States, and apparently includes western Mexico maybe. A very, very interesting change in land though. And yet we see one of the commonalities, a city that still exists today, San Francisco, and a city that comes up in many of our explorations. It appears on this Urbano Monte map from the 1580s. Do we have any Great Lakes, or do we have a different layout of lakes? So is it simply the fact that Urbano Monte did not know exactly what the lands looked like, or was he accurately recording and showing the lands as he understood them to be? It's a very interesting series of considerations. Could the lands have changed? And that's why on Urbano Monte's map they are laid out very differently. It's a question we have to continuously ask because we see this on many maps from the past. Let's take a look at the history of the land currently called Russia when it was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics from 1922 to 1991, the growth of the Russian Bear. And recall that we always look at the history and consider the way that the nations perceived each other. It's one of the ways that we understand history. From our official history, we understand that Russia took a little time before it came into the true Industrial Revolution, still under the rules of the Tsars, and even the concept of the connection of the Tsars being related perhaps to an older civilization. Now, I may not necessarily be a proponent of that theory, but it is something that I can't discount. Today, looking at how Russia expanded to the east, exploring Siberia, and there's a lot of official historical accounts about that. The old Carolingian Empire, the successor of the Frankish Empire, ruled by Charlemagne or Charles the Great, and oddly enough, the one time when there was a pan-European union that was achieved, fulfilling the dream of future pan-European advocate Richard Coudenhove Kalergi, a gentleman from Austria. And you can certainly read his book Pan-Europa, and he's written many other interesting books, as I guess some people from Austria tend to do. I find it interesting, though, that the successor states of the Carolingian Empire, both France and Germany, were involved in extreme attempts to invade Russia. Everyone's well aware of Napoleon's Russian campaign in 1812, and we explored it very carefully when we explored Napoleon, Who exactly was Napoleon? Well, officially he was the Emperor of France, an individual from Corsica who rose through the ranks. And there was a recent movie made about Napoleon by Ridley Scott, which seemed to make him seem like an uninspiring character. At least in my estimation. Maybe you thought he was an inspiring character. Nothing against Joaquin Phoenix's acting. But this long march and this attempt by Napoleon to force Russia to agree to his continental system, even though the capital of Russia was well known to be St. Petersburg at the time. So was he expecting to find the Tsar in Moscow? Why did he go for Moscow? One of those interesting questions. And then in 1941, when the Third Reich commenced the largest invasion in human history, launching 3 entire army groups in order to force Russia to surrender, or the Soviet Union as it was at that time, based on the culling of officers under the Stalinist regime and the fact that the Wehrmacht assessed that they could overrun the Soviet Union. There were major sieges around the cities of St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg was under siege for over 3 years. St. Petersburg, which we've looked at and explored before. Moscow itself was very nearly threatened, but the Germans never actually captured Moscow. And then, of course, the great terrifying battle of Stalingrad, the other name for Volgograd, a name in a city that's changed numerous times, although it's interesting to note that Volgograd originally started as a giant fortress. And then the Caucasus regions. So what was the purpose behind all these invasions? We understand the concept of resources being required, but yet there's different reasons, and yet all the effort that was expended to try to invade Russia. Modern Russia was attributed to Peter the Great, pictured here. And this was a picture that Peter the Great, the Tsar, had done and then contributed to the British monarchy. Yes, I'm going to have a picture done of myself, and maybe he signed it. It's a wonderful picture. And perhaps he was simply trying to curry positive favor. Here's the throne that Peter sat on, Peter the Great, and there's even a hole in the back of it where his half-sister Sophia was stated to whisper to him matters of state. And that's another interesting character that we have, the actual family of the Tsar. And if you're interested in seeing our exploration on that, by all means, go back and take a look at the Moscow exploration. How intriguing that we actually have a monarch who is influenced by his half-sister. I don't know, it kind of reminds me of something. Not exactly sure what. Certainly nothing like an individual who sounds like Peter Ustinov being told by his snake what to do. But when we look at the official history behind this, we have the usual palace intrigue. Sophia was a very interesting character who was able to participate in politics, even if it wasn't something that a woman of the time would do. There's no doubt that this particular image is, well, how shall we say, designed to make Sophia look rather terrifying. I mean, look at those eyes. But was that who she was really? Or was she a more sympathetic character in history? Or what exactly was her true nature? It's always intriguing to me asking these questions because this was the very formation of Russia as a considered imperial power. Peter eventually died of health issues, and there's some very horrific details behind some of the health issues that he endured before passing away in his 50s. Apparently, he had access to doctors of the Mayo Clinic caliber of the time, and they were able to relieve immense pressure on his bladder. Apparently, he had 4 pounds worth of urine that was backed up within it. What a terrible way to die. Seems like he suffered quite immensely. But why am I covering all these details? What exactly is this relevant for our exploration? We have this very rich and fascinating history of Russia, much as we do for the other European nations. So really what this tells us is that on the surface, there is no definitive difference between Russia and the other European nations, such as Germany, France, what is today the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Portugal, Spain, and so on and so forth. But looking at this very, very impressive St. Isaac's Cathedral that we've explored in St. Petersburg, a city that was called Leningrad during the Soviet regime, and also recalling the story of the Thunderstone that they put the statue of St. Peter on top of. How exactly did they get this Thunderstone in the middle of the city? And then looking at the interesting account that we have of the many monarchs in the early 20th century, or the World War I period. Of course, the final Tsar, Nicholas, the last of the Romanovs, Nicholas II. But who was Nicholas really? What was his exact role within this civilization? And why is it that we have a very, very interesting and close resemblance between Nicholas II and other monarchs at that time. Now, if you're not familiar with history, is this individual here pictured Nicholas II, or is this someone else? I'm not going to tell you because I'm asking you right now. Do you know the difference? And, of course, if you're from the United Kingdom or study history, you know that this is King George V. And yet he bears a very striking resemblance to Nicholas II, or Nicholas II bears a striking resemblance to him. The reason I'm highlighting this is that we believe that we have this very well-detailed historical account of who these monarchs were. But who exactly were these individuals? Why do they have so many familiar features? And it's not just members of the monarchy or ranking members of the government where we see this phenomenon occur. Now, of course, we'll have the usual explanation that, yes, of course, there's similarities in the appearance of certain human beings, and that's how we can account for this. And, of course, that many of these individuals were from the same family. Although, it's rather intriguing trying to deconflict the exact details that we have behind many of these monarchies and their families, especially when you consider the amount of, how shall we say, finding a certain breeding path that led to the families not having a very good genetic diversity, at least as we understand science to that day. And there's also the interesting case of Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, or actually hailing from Prussia, when Germany was unified under the rule of Prussia. Kaiser Wilhelm II, quite an interesting individual, and even more unique is, in addition to his love for elaborate military uniforms, he actually seemed to like wearing military uniforms of other nations. Here he's with Tsar Nicholas II, and they've switched uniforms. Not too much difference aside from the hat and the spiked helmet. And of course, they both have the fancy boots. What is really going on, though, again, with all these individuals, this royalty? They seem to have a very close relationship. And here's another image that we have of Kaiser Wilhelm II wearing a Turkish field marshal's uniform. Well, I guess at least that makes sense. They were allies, but why would he go gallivanting around in the uniforms of other nations, whether they were allies or not? It's all very intriguing, especially when we look at the very interesting relationship that we have between Russia, Western Europe, and of course the United States. World War I, the war to end all wars, the Great War, the many different names for it, occurring from 1914 to 1918, and we've looked at it in the channel before. Unyielding trench warfare, fought on multiple fronts in Europe. And you can certainly see in a little cartoon like this why an image like this would no doubt inflame the patriotic notions behind many Americans. And you've got the good old recruiting poster of Uncle Sam saying, "I want you." And thus the United States entered into World War I and brought about a successful conclusion for the Western Allies. Of course, the American adventure in World War I proved to be a very difficult one. The other nations were fighting since 1914, and the sudden introduction of American manpower changed the scale of the war in favor of the Western Allies, overcoming what was called the Central Powers at the time. This is a very interesting photo, though, from Camp Funston in Kansas that was taken shortly after World War I ended. If you served recently in the United States military, you're well aware of the fact that Camp Funston, which is off of Fort Riley, Kansas today, was where military transition teams that served in Afghanistan were trained. But in this particular time frame, circa 1918 to 1919, it was a hospital, dealing with the outbreak of the Spanish flu at the time. And we see some interesting details in some of these images. I'm always amazed at how these images, in a way, appear very contemporary. And looking at the details, for example, we'd expect everyone to be wearing masks, given the fact that we understand that face masks would protect people, or at least we know that this image is not from Madison, Wisconsin in 2020, because everybody would certainly be wearing their masks. This, what looks to be an officer, I'm not sure, is certainly not wearing a mask. And most of the individuals in this image are not wearing masks. So what really to make of this? It's quite intriguing. What did the Americans sign up for, though, in World War I? Well, they thought that they were going to be fighting the Germans, the Central Powers, and assisting France and Great Britain in preventing the Germans from capturing Paris. But one thing Americans probably didn't expect was the fact that they were actually going to be participating in an intervention in Russia. Now, it wasn't an invasion. There's a very subtle difference between an invasion and an intervention. This was an intervention because Russia was in a civil war at that time. The Bolsheviks, or the Red Russians, were fighting the anti-Bolsheviks, or the White Russians, and the United States moved to help its allies, namely the United Kingdom or Great Britain, by landing at Archangel, where a large American contingent landed of nearly 5,000 American soldiers. So yes, officially, there were American soldiers present in Russia at the end of World War I. There were all sorts of reports that the Americans that participated in this little expedition were not exactly pleased about it, and that morale was low. There was also a large American contingent of 5,000 soldiers sent to Vladivostok, off of eastern Siberia and the Coldwater port there. How intriguing. And it's also yet another account that we have of this interesting international intervention that seemed to occur all this time. The United States was not the only nation that sent foreign soldiers to intervene in Russia's conflict. There was also participants from Czechoslovakia, Great Britain, and Japan. In fact, according to the official accounts, it seems that Japan sent the most number of soldiers to intervene in this conflict. Yet, despite this intervention, we know how the Russian Civil War ended up with a Bolshevik victory and the foundation of the the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. It's been a while since I've said it. I used to just roll it right off the tongue. And here we have a picture showing the officers. Ah, yes, that must be the American. There's just something about him that just says United States Army within that intense look. A look that hasn't changed. And here we have General Richardson, the American general that was sent to extract the force from Archangel, Russia, after morale had gotten a little low. There were even rumors of mutinies. Of course, these rumors were fervently denied. Who exactly knows what happened? Although I gotta say, this General Richardson, who was a graduate of the United States Military Academy in the 1800s, looks like he'd be a great individual to play offensive line for the Army team today. The evacuation was successful, and the operation was forgotten. Are you aware that there was a very interesting financial arrangement, though, between the United States and its former allies, well, actually its current allies, and then its former antagonist after World War I? This is a picture that shows the culture of the Weimar Republic, that government that existed in Germany between the Kaiser and, of course, the Third Reich. And how exactly was this government funded? Well, we have this very interesting account where we had Wall Street bankers that provided loans to Great Britain so they could fight World War I, and then Great Britain paid back those loans to the United States from war reparations from Germany. But the war reparations for Germany were also being funded by loans from the United States. So what a very, very interesting and convoluted picture that we have. The United States was providing loans to its allies during the war, sensible enough. But then after the war, it was providing loans to Germany so that it could repay reparations to the former adversarial nations. And then the money that was being paid to its former adversarial nations as part of the Treaty of Versailles was then coming back to the U.S. Treasury. So I guess they always say follow the money, but you end up with a very vicious circle of infinity. Or as the banker J.B. Johnston in the TV series Miami Vice, a Wall Street banker, fictional of course, said, "Those of us who have money can make more of it by loaning it to those who don't." And not so long ago, our bank loaned a lot of money to our allies in Germany and France. Or excuse me, in Great Britain and France. Of course, then they loaned money to Germany, so then they could repay those reparations. And it was called the Dawes Plan. And what a very interesting financial arrangement. And I highlight this because this shows all this unique cooperation that we have. Now you're probably going to ask, did Great Britain ever pay back all the money that the United States loaned it during World War I? The answer is yes, but it wasn't until relatively recently. They loaned them a lot of money. And we know that the Dawes Plan collapsed with the Great Depression, or the stock market crash in the United States in 1929. That's what happens when you have one nation funding everything. There's also the fact that the United States, again showing its very ambivalent relationship with the Soviet Union or Russia, much as Europe always seems to have a very ambivalent relationship with Russia or the Soviet Union, provided Russia with a lot of key materials as part of the Land Lease program during World War II, to ensure that the Soviet Union was able to prosecute a successful war against the terrifying enemy, Nazi Germany. And of course, everybody understood that's exactly what the conflict was all about, and that was the main goal. So it could at least explain why the United States seems to have switched its foreign policy, or at least its consideration of the Soviet Union. Remember that right at the end of World War I, President Wilson was willing to send American soldiers, large contingents, after fighting in the trenches, to go to Russia to try to prevent the Bolsheviks from taking power. But then, by World War II, that foreign policy had shifted, there was a more threatening adversary, so now the United States decided to ship equipment to the Soviet Union to enable it to successfully fight that war. How intriguing. Always going back and forth on this foreign policy. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is anything out of the ordinary. It's just interesting to me that there's always this unique interest from the Western world in Russia or the Soviet Union. And how much did the United States provide the Soviet Union? Well, just recap it real quick. 427,000 trucks, 6,300 combat vehicles, half-tracks, 7,000 tanks. Don't you find that amazing, since we know that the Soviet Union built some of the very best tanks, and quite a few of them, the venerable T-34, during World War II. But they also had American equipment. 11,400 aircraft, 2,000 ambulances, 35,000 motorcycles. We'll have to say, with all those motorcycles, it looks like the Soviet Union could have built themselves some very robust motorcycle reconnaissance units for World War II. And what about logistics? You know how I always love to talk about and think about logistics. The United States provided them 1,977 locomotives, 11,000 specialized cars, 4,400,000 tons of food. That's a lot of food. No doubt rations, but then look at this. 53% of the total U.S. ammo production, 57% of Soviet aviation fuel, and then apparently they took factories too. Boy, moving factories in Soviet Union was just such a big thing during World War II. They moved their own factories, and then they brought in factories from the United States. So no wonder, with all this equipment and all of these wondrous logistics the United States was able to produce during World War II, that when World War II ended, that they just happened to throw it off the side of the ship. And don't you find it even more interesting that when we did the reset barren exploration, recall that the United States began taxing a much greater portion of its citizenry to pay for World War II. And then in more recent conflicts, such as Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States also left behind a lot of military equipment. Here we have an M1A1 tank that has been acquired by ISIS. And here we have a United States-made high-mobility multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, Humvee, that's been acquired and used by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Well, I guess you can say at least this equipment wasn't tossed in the ocean to rot, and somebody's at least getting some use out of it. I always wondered, why instead of just throwing the equipment in the ocean, maybe the United States just should have provided all that equipment to the Soviet Union. It would have made a better diplomatic relation, right? And here's just some of the military equipment that the United States left behind in Afghanistan. That kind of surprised me to see 3 C-130s, over 3,000 Humvees, 33 Black Hawk helicopters. Yes, it's rather amazing. I mean, we're not talking about just a few rounds or a couple rifles here. We're talking about over 3,000 M4 carbines. What a series of military logistics that have now gone to equip the Taliban. I'm not questioning policy, it's just really intriguing when you look at all the details behind this. It's also interesting to note when someone tried to calculate what the cost was of the United States interventions in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Originally, the number was a lot lower. Now, of course, if you'll look it up today, you certainly won't see something listed in the hundreds of billions, but you'll see a number up to the trillions, either $4 to $8 trillion. But going on past the United States military adventures of the past, present, and future, one thing I find interesting is all these international foreign interventions that occurred. Prior to the international foreign intervention that occurred in the Russian Civil War after World War I, circa 1919, we had the foreign intervention that occurred in the so-called Boxer Rebellion in China. Why is it we have all these different armies deciding to cooperate and move into a particular land area? Why is it always in Asia? Or why is it always in the same general vicinity? Is the history exactly as we understand it, or is something else going on? Does it somehow mirror the social revolutions of 1848 in Europe? And yet, if you look at the official history, you'll find out that many of the leaders of the social revolutions of 1848 in Europe ended up serving as generals, mostly for the Union, in the United States Civil War. And then, of course, there's that conflict that they, for whatever reason, just don't talk about so much in American history, and that was when the Fenian forces went and raided Canada. And who were the Fenians, you ask? They were Irish soldiers who had served in both the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War, who apparently weren't tired enough of conflict and decided to go attack Canada. And in Canada, this event is more well remembered. Like here we see a formation of the Canadian militia, about to engage in a very significant battle against the Fenians. Although it's rather intriguing to note that the casualties behind these battles were very, very low. So, not exactly sure what to make of it. What exactly was the nature of these conflicts? How exactly was the United States, which was very well armed at the end of the Civil War and still had a very large standing army in the field, and let's not forget one of the great captains of American military history, of course I'm not saying captain as an official rank, but as a reference, General Ulysses S. Grant, allow this to happen? Some say it was because of the poor leadership of President Andrew Johnson at the time. Who knows for sure? Or was there something else going on? And let's not forget the Crimean War. Yet another international cooperation that occurred to attack Russia in Crimea. Or were they fighting Russia on behalf of Turkey? Or was something else entirely going on? I'm always amazed looking at these uniforms. I have to give these soldiers credit, wearing these vast amounts of clothing in extreme weather instead of just wool uniforms. So it all goes back to that question that we have, what exactly was happening in history? Were these conflicts exactly as we were told that they were? Or do they represent something else entirely? Do they represent the final phase of finishing a previous reset, where what remained of any vestiges of the old order or the old civilization were completely swept away? Who knows for sure? It's up to you to decide. So looking at this background, what do we have with Russia? Looking at St. Petersburg, we have no shortage of images that seem to show abandoned cities, such as St. Petersburg here. We can certainly appreciate the fact that St. Petersburg endured a very terrifying siege during World War II. But what exactly do these images really tell us? Do they give us the inclination or indication that perhaps the structures and even the entire city or the original city layout of St. Petersburg has a very different origin than what we understand? Could it even be possible that these cities and the very eastern end of European Russia, as we define it, might have an entirely different origin? There's something rather strange to me about the fact that the Urals is the dividing line between the two continents of Asia and Europe. Why is that? If that's the fact that mountains can divide continents, then why is, say, for example, the Rockies in the United States not a dividing line between two continents? Thinking back to that earlier indication that we had on the Urbano-Monte map. There's no shortage of images of incredible and elaborate structures that were constructed during a time that official history tells us that most of the people of Russia under the rule of the Tsar were simple peasants or serfs, those who were stuck to the land that they were on. And yet we see incredible architectural achievements. Now, whatever the veracity of these images that we're looking at, if these were actual photos taken from the date that we understand them as official history tells us, or have they been changed over time? Again, it doesn't mean that there was necessarily a conspiracy. Maybe the photos were just touched up. Maybe they were transferred from one book to another. Maybe the album changed them. Of course, learning official history in the United States, one of the things that we were informed is that there was a lot of propaganda that happened, especially once the Soviet regime took over. And if you watch the miniseries Chernobyl, then you have the understanding that there was not a lot of trust and faith within the Soviet government. So what from the historical account was changed? That's the kind of question that we have to ask. And of course, it's the same question that I ask considering anything with the United States. The layout of St. Petersburg has always impressed me. The layout of the city and its actual origin. And going back and trying to reconcile its existence on earlier maps in terms of what its exact layout was. Much like when we looked at Volgograd, trying to understand the origin of the city. Did it all start with a very simple star fort structure? What exactly was the origin of St. Isaac's Cathedral? And why is it that we have all these impressive details, the same construction details that we see in other cities? The domes, the pediments, the columns. Well, once again, official history will tell you that Russia admired the incredible constructions across Europe, and of course they returned to Roman Greco constructions. They wanted to emulate them. Yes, I suppose you can accept that. You can also accept the story that the Kremlin in Moscow was done by an architect out of Italy. But you look at some of these other images, and it gives you the impression of a much more integrated and impressive transportation system. We see trolleys in many locations. And here in this interesting artwork, trying to understand what a repurposing, or dare I even say a salvaging, of old technology from the past really was. Is that what the Industrial Revolution was to represent? And was it the same thing in Russia and eventually the Soviet Union with the 5-year plans that it was in the rest of the land, especially the United Kingdom and the United States? We even have these impressive interiors, whether it's the Winter Palace or the Grand Palace or any of the other numerous incredible palaces that are across Russia. And make no mistake about it, they are some of the finest palaces in the land. But how exactly were they constructed? What's the real origin and history behind these cities? And why are we really looking at the possibility of a theory of a mud flood in this area? Well, going off of alternative research, there do seem to be a lot of origin points of, at least the theories, coming from Russia or the Soviet Union. But is that by design, or is that just because that's where the theories were allowed to survive? Or is it also because of the fact that, due to our understanding that we can't trust, again going off the official historical evaluation from the United States, the history of the Soviet Union, now Russia, then perhaps that leaves room for understanding that nothing of our theories is without question. Well, the truth of the matter is, history can always be questioned. History is always being reevaluated. I recall one of my very first deep dives into history, and it was evaluating a book called Enemy at the Gates, which coincidentally was a book written by author William Craig about the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, this book came out in the early 1970s, and William Craig had access to first-hand accounts. In other words, veterans that had actually participated in the battle. But because of the existence of the Iron Curtain at that time, or the East-West divide with the so-called Cold War, Craig was only able to interview the German veterans. So he really didn't get an account from the Soviet side of the conflict. That came later. But what's interesting to me is, because of the fact that we have these two great powers, one that was decisively defeated in World War II, and another whose government collapsed officially in 1991, what's exactly the true history? And keep in mind, we're only talking about World War II here. And this is something that perplexed me when I did my initial historical studies, because I can remember the history of many of the details of World War II have been, how shall we say, revised over time. I'm not suggesting that there's a conspiracy, merely stating that because different sources became available, that certain accounts were changed. There were details behind the Battle of Stalingrad that were changed. There were details behind major operational and campaign plans that were changed. And so, because of that, there doesn't even need to be a conspiracy for the history not to be correctly understood. But then you run into another problem when you engage in historical revision. How is it you can know with a clearer detail what happened with more intervening years? In other words, how can we know more clearly in 2021 what happened in 1941 than we did in 1971? That's always a question that comes up when you're actually trying to study history, and it's an ongoing problem. It's a challenge. Now, of course, we have defined authorities, and we have genuine certified historians who are going to give you the final evaluation on what happened. And keep in mind that official historians, along with scientists, are the people that can tell you the difference between a legitimate conspiracy that occurred or has occurred and merely a conspiracy theory. And make no mistakes about it, I am not a certified historian. So, just letting you know that and being honest with all of you. So, these explorations really trying to understand what we see here. Looking at this from an intellectual perspective, trying to be as objective as possible. And there are a lot of great historians who've never set foot in Russia. And yet they seem to have a good idea of exactly what happened. I think of the accounts of Potemkin. Here, looking at this particular image in Moscow, and we see some of this interesting slant construction. You have these very rudimentary horses and carts, and you have this incredibly elaborate and beautiful architecture. Now again, trying to answer that question, when exactly was this structure constructed? How was it constructed? Why is it that we're not doing this again? And keep in mind, these were not built as standalone structures. Whether we're looking at St. Petersburg or Moscow, these are vast city blocks. And go back to the beginning of the exploration and take a look at the actual video footage that we have of these very, very impressive layouts in these incredible cities. How much has survived from the past and what's changed over time? Remember that the most destructive battles in human history, and we're not just talking about aerial bombardments, these were land battles. The city of Stalingrad, Volgograd now, was completely destroyed by both an air and a land battle. St. Petersburg was under siege for 3 years. And Moscow itself did not escape the direct effects, even if the city was not engaged in a direct battle. The German forces did come very close to Moscow in 1941, but it was never under a state of extended siege or cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. So these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask when we look at these images. Why is it that the origin of a lot of these theories did come out of Russia or the former Soviet Union? Or did they? Is that just simply our understanding of it? Yes, I know. Even understanding the history of alternative research is questionable. It's why you really have to rely on yourself and your own objective observations. And as I always say, the history may well have unfolded just the way that we were told it was. But with every single exploration, with every single detail, and every new revelation that we have, that appears to be less and less likely. Now, there may be other explanations for this, and going back and looking at the great city of Stalingrad, Volgograd, or Tsaristan, as it was originally known as. So many different names. So many different names for one city. It originally started off as a fortress, and it grew up rather rapidly in the early 1900s. Some of the architecture remains to this day. How much of this architecture is original, and how much of it has been modified over time. When you really look into the history behind these great cities in what is today Russia, you'll find the same conflicting accounts. You'll even find the same history of renovations, the same rather bizarre history of architects. Certain structures that simply have an architect assigned to them, and yet no history of contractors. Well, of course, that's easily explained. In Russia, they just had forced labor, especially during the reign of the Tsar. That's what the official history will tell you. Look up the history of the construction of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Why didn't Napoleon go for St. Petersburg again? I mean, certainly he knew it was the capital city and that's where the Tsar would be, but he decided to go for Moscow? That one never really made a lot of sense to me, but maybe it was just another one of those random blunders that Napoleon made, despite being so perfect for so long. All these cities, all these battles, and all this destruction, and yet we have the same patterns that we've seen in other places in the land. Conflict, assimilation, indoctrination. Russia is certainly no different with its official history, and there's many strange parallels that we've talked about with the history of the United States. The exploration of lands, the ongoing conflict, the unfortunate indigenous peoples who seem to simply be in the way of national expansion. Again, at least that's what the official history said. Or was there something else entirely different that was happening, that were simply concealed by certain events that were reported in a different facet? Why do we have what appears to be more advanced technology present in these early photographs of the city of Volgograd? What exactly does it allude to? Well, it's the same clues that we've seen in cities all across the land. I think about some of the cities we've explored in the United States, such as Janesville in Wisconsin, where we see random isolated locations. And also remember, was there something in Volgograd, or Stalingrad as it was known as during World War II, that necessitated such an intense conflict? Yes, of course, official history will tell us that just because of the name of the city, it was why German Army Group South clashed with many army groups of the Red Army, and an epic conflict occurred. There's even other strange historical anomalies, such as this interesting Orthodox church that was on a boat. What a very well-constructed church on a boat that went up and down the River Volga. Is this something that really happened? Isn't this intriguing when you think about where these designs go to this day? And then, of course, the same history that we have of monasteries, convents. In fact, recall Peter the Great's half-sister Sophia. She ended her life by being confined to a convent. It seems that Peter the Great had overcome her, and that's why that image seemed to show a different person. So a very interesting and conflicted history with many conflicting accounts, much as we have in the United States. But yet, no less an example of many architectural beauties and wonders. And so, in summary, what do we really have with this Europa mud flood? What do we have with some of these modern structures that endure to this day? Was this particular church rebuilt recently, as history would indicate? Or is it merely a renovated old world structure that's been attributed to construction? For that fact, with the original monument that we looked at, the Motherland Calls, what's the history behind it? And then we have this very interesting planetarium in Volgograd, Russia. Now, this has quite the interesting history behind it. This was a gift from East Germany to the Stalin Soviet Union in the 1950s. Now, being aware of history like we are, we understand that East Germany was completely destroyed as a nation, as was West Germany for that fact. Their infrastructure was destroyed, their entire nation was defeated and occupied. And yet so soon, before an economic recovery could even occur, they were building structures such as this. They somehow built this structure, this planetarium in Volgograd, Stalingrad at the time, and provided it as a gift for their new, what do we say? We won't say conquerors, do we say liberators? Or are they considered in an intervention? We always have all these different terms. But I'm very impressed that East Germany was able to build a structure like this impressive planetarium. Ah, yes, another one of these interesting planetariums. And we see that it has a lot of old world architecture to it. It's fascinating to note that there's still structures that have a construction date from the 1950s that still have a lot of question marks around them. And I would say that this planetarium is no different. And I just wanted to highlight this one specific example in this particular exploration because it intrigued me. It's an example of a structure that has a more recent construction date, the 1950s, but trying to reconcile the official history is very intriguing. How exactly was East Germany able to build this? Did they build it, or did they simply provide the finances that they clearly didn't have to allow local construction contractors in Stalingrad at the time to erect this incredible planetarium with these impressive columns and these very unique designs and symbols? And yet, for whatever reason, they're using symbols that we've seen in other old world structures that don't seem to make a lot of sense. I would very much like to visit this planetarium in Volgograd off the River Volga and really try to ascertain what its origin is and the construction materials. I would really like to gain an understanding for how it was brought up so quickly and what it really represents. Because it seems as though this structure, for whatever reason, just looking at the images of it, appears to be a lot older than we might think it would be. Why is it we always have these stories of these structures with these interesting origins, with these unique stories that just don't seem to add up? I mean, of course, it's a planetarium, so we're going to see a lot of displays that commemorate space exploration. Now, keep in mind, in the 1950s, according to the official history, the Soviet Union was leading space exploration at that time. The United States had to catch up. The Soviet Union put the first satellite into orbit, officially. But going past all that, looking at all the impressive architecture within this planetarium, why exactly would such an elaborate and classical planetarium be constructed? What exactly does it represent? And look closely at these symbols. Tell me where we've seen these symbols before. Because yes, they have appeared before. And what's the origin behind this particular walk and the construction of the structure itself? It's quite fascinating because it really is a conflicting account. And yet from every visible indication, it does appear to be a legitimate old world structure. And really that's one of the difficult issues that we have of how the historical account becomes obfuscated over time. And whether we're talking about a hospital in Rochester, Minnesota that was constructed in the late 1880s, or a very impressive Art Deco building that was built in the 1920s in New York City, or, of course, a planetarium here in Volgograd, Russia, we seem to have the exact same questions in the exact same account behind these impressive icons, these structures, these symbols. What exact construction material was used in this? Now, an interesting facet with the Motherland Calls monument, in addition to the fact that it's being considered to be inducted as a UNESCO World Heritage Monument, is the fact that there's been numerous renovations that have been required on it. It is built of concrete officially. But if you have something with, how shall we say, more of an officially authoritarian government, then does it become possible to obfuscate things? And I just thought I'd include a few images of what this planetarium looks like today, and you can see that it seems to have the latest of the great, how shall we say, Apple generation, with wonderful lights and neon effects placed in it. Yet, even with these, how shall we say, modern lighting arrangements, we can still see the old world architecture that endures, such as with the stairs and the banister, and then of course the columns here. And then even some of the detailing where the columns actually meet the ceiling. Are they load-bearing, or are they simply for decorative purposes? Another question that we always ask. And then even the fact that with the lighting we can still see the original focus of the structure. Whatever its actual origin and original purpose, if it had one, it still survives today as a very beautiful structure. Something that seems to indicate that there's something more interesting going on. This planetarium that you can still visit today if you go to Volgograd, Russia. Now, of course, I know what you're saying. Yes, most of us are in the Western nations. That's probably not going to be happening anytime soon as a result of our current political situation with Russia. And I think that's a very unique note to end this part of the exploration on, because there are many incredible sites in Russia. There is the fact that we do have that interesting divide line with the Ural Mountains. The unique historical accounts of entire factories being moved from European Russia to the other side of the Urals during the German invasion in 1941. And then, of course, there's interesting sites in the Urals, these incredible rocks, at least that's what we understand them to be. Incredible stones, or incredible rock formations might be the best way to describe them, of truly impressive colossal size. What exactly are these? Now, by all means, let me know what you think in the comments, and I welcome all opinions. If you think they're just rocks, they're just rocks. There's even other strange accounts across Russia, such as this particular church that was flooded as the result of a dam being constructed. And this is a very unique site, because you'd be surprised to know that there are actually more accounts of this particular situation happening, and not just in Russia, where as a result of a change of the flow of water, the construction of a dam, or a dam being damaged, that we end up having the remnants of a very legitimate old world structure being flooded, and then of course it being surrounded by water. This has to be one of the more interesting accounts that we have of this. And then even on the nearby quote-unquote shore, we still have old world buildings, this once being part of a very large and impressive church. Now, do you think that this is a legitimate old world structure that was concealed? Now, granted that this dam, the construction of it was by order of Joseph Stalin, but looking at it from different angles, we have different impressions behind it. This is definitely a site that I would very much appreciate exploring on site. I can only imagine how many details could be found with it. And if you think of the fact of exploring certain structures on site, there is a lot more to be gleaned. For example, I think of some of the most impressive structures that I've explored within the United States, and they're not in the places I would have expected. I would say that some of the most impressive construction material I've encountered has been the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines, Iowa. I know you thought I was going to say Iowa State Capitol. It's really good, but the exterior of the Polk County Courthouse in Des Moines is something otherworldly. And then, of course, the entire construction of the Plummer Building in Rochester, Minnesota. So I have to wonder, what exact conclusions could I come to going to Russia and exploring these impressive structures, exploring these amazing rock formations? What exactly are these in the Urals? What do they represent? Why is there still so much mystery that's associated with this area? And of course, people say there are no mysteries, but they're the people who don't want to actually consider that perhaps we haven't actually answered everything that's out there. There's nothing unscientific about saying, I don't know. In fact, I recall Data saying that one of the most Fundamental admissions for anyone is simply stating, I don't know. I don't know what the origin of this structure is, and I don't know exactly why it was flooded. But I have many theories behind it, and I think that's what makes Russia such an incredible place. Was there a mud flood in Europa? Is there something that's very significant about this gateway, this dividing line of the Urals, that divides officially the continent of Europe from Asia? Why is there so much focus on it? Well, please stand by and continue watching. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be exploring the mysteries of Siberia is something that captures our imagination for a variety of reasons. It's very interesting to consider the fact that Siberia is not often discussed directly in historical studies, despite the fact that many of the known lands encompass Siberia. And there's a very definitive question as to why this is. When we think of Siberia, our minds go to an imagination of wondrous mountains and cold frozen tundras. And for people who are into studying World War II and the communist regime, they think of the terrifying gulags. Yet there's much more extensive aspect to Siberia than what may reach the mind. For one, it's the mere size of this geographical area. It's also the fact that there are many coincidences when it comes to Siberia. In fact, if you look up coincidence and what you actually observe in Siberia, well, they should probably add it to the dictionary. Naturally, they won't. Very stunning rock formations that do not match simple explanation. Although our esteemed scientists and historians will tell us there is a natural explanation for all of these rock formations, and there is nothing mysterious at all about Siberia. In this exploration, we're going to take a different look at the perspectives of some of these rock formations. We're also going to consider how Siberia relates to our studies of the Old World and previous civilizations. The mainstream does acknowledge that there are previous civilizations in Siberia, but of course they have a very different perspective of them than what we're going to be looking at today. Well, let's begin our exploration going down the cold and frozen road to learn the truth of Siberia. Let's begin by taking a look at Siberia and Russia. Now, we just explored Moscow earlier this week, and we see that Moscow is on the western end of this vast tract of land. Now, how large is Siberia? Well, depending on the exact source, you'll see anywhere from 4.9 to 5 million square miles. How exactly large is that? Well, Siberia, as you can see, comprises the vast amount of territory of the Russian Federation. Or for comparison, it is 1/3 larger than the entire land area of the United States and 1/4 larger than the entire land area of Canada. And looking at that, you can see why that's true. We also have a very suspicious area here that looks like that it's been bombed out or subjected to some terrific forces. Now, of course, we'll have the scientific explanation that'll tell us that this is because of the extreme cold, this is from some sort of permafrost or erosion, the usual culprits when we look at land areas such as this. However, I find such a land area very suspicious because it does look like it's been struck by something from the air, but perhaps, as we always say, it's just a coincidence. Anyone can see, though, that this is a vast tract of land, and it comprises a very large area. In fact, nearly 1/10 of all the lands in the known world are in Siberia. Looking at the Urbano-Monte map from 1587, we can see that he did depict lands up at the North Pole. And in our recent explorations, to include St. Petersburg and Moscow, we can see potentially how a pre-existing civilization that may have started in those lands could have expanded and reached the northern areas of what is now Russia. And in fact, we can see here the northern area of Siberia. A lot of questions and a lot of coincidences that seem to arise with this. Now, looking at many other maps, we'll see that the area is oftentimes listed as Tartaria. And the mainstream tells us that this is actually just Greater Tartary, that there was never any such nation called Tartaria. Well, I'm going to say on this particular exploration, it really doesn't matter what it was called. What matters is the fact that we're talking about a vast tract of land that has pre-existing civilizations associated with it, which the mainstream acknowledges, and we're going to be looking at that. Looking overall at Siberia, though, we can see that this vast tract of land that is larger than the United States and larger than Canada has different components to it. We have the West Siberian Plain, which is just east of the Ural Mountains. Now, the traditional definition of the divide between Asia and Europe is said to be the Ural Mountains. There are some other sources that will tell you it's other mountains, and maybe we just need to have Superman fly down there and verify where the fault line actually is. It's one gigantic landmass. That's the important thing. The Siberian Plateau in central Siberia, and then here in northeast Siberia with the Kamchatka Peninsula. Always an area that was known historically because this is where it bordered near Alaska. But there's just so many lands and so many different rivers and unexplored areas. We'll be assured that it is explored. And when I said earlier that there's not much of a historical association, it always feels as though the studies of history tend to dance around Siberia. You'll hear little references to it in the railroad and the main route, and people always talked about, people as in historians, official historians if you want to call them that, they would always discuss the Siberian route and how critical and strategic it was, especially during conflicts of the past and the old Silk Road and the trade route. And you can see why Moscow would be such a strategic city looking at that route. Well, we start by looking at the beautiful Lena pillars. These pillars are all 150 to 300 meters or 490 to 980 feet high. This runs along the Lena River. We will be told, in fact, we will be assured ad nauseum by our scientists, our geologists, that this is a natural rock formation. And it's quite a puzzling enigma to begin the exploration with, because when you look at all these rock formations, you can't help but realize just how uniform they are. Why exactly are they referred to as pillars? Well, you'll probably get an explanation if you ask a geologist. It's because they look like pillars. And when you look at how extensive and how far this goes on the Lena River, you can't help but realize that these are pillars. And these formations appear at various places for miles and miles. Yet looking a little bit more closer at them, we see a more fine geometrical symmetry to them. What is really going on here? And as if you need any more suspicion to this Lena pillar area, consider the fact that this is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And looking here at this chart, we can see the number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites that are registered each year, supposed to have cultural significance. Why exactly does a natural rock formation have cultural significance? In fact, in my mind, this is even more suspicious than if they just said that this was a large golf course. Although looking at this very well-shaped rock pillar that was formed naturally, consider how difficult a game of golf might be if you're trying to tee off on the top of that. The thing that I find surprising, though, looking at these pillars is just how uniform they are. And also consider that their height has a very unique coincidence to it. And once again, if you're going to accept the fact that this is a natural rock formation, you also have to accept the fact that there are many coincidences that are associated with it. Now, what exactly am I referring to? Well, you look at the fine structure behind these pillars. There's the fact that they call them pillars, and no matter what angle you look at them from, you have to overlook the fact that erosion is supposed to leave things in a fine, rounded shape. Well, it only does until it's not supposed to, and there's always exceptions to every rule. And I understand that. But is there any other place in the land that you're going to see pillars that are formed like this? Pillars that are formed by natural forces that look like pillars to this extent. We've done other explorations where we've questioned what we see in buildings that we know were very clearly made by artificial means. And yet, looking at these pillars, we're told that these are natural. Also consider what they tell us that these pillars are made out of. They tell us that these pillars are made primarily out of limestone. And of course, there's some other stones that they say are factored into it. But looking at them a little more holistically, we see that actually examining these in person, I wonder what kind of material, what kind of composition we'd find. And I'm not some person to rely on some Felder-Carb machine to tell me exactly what the composition of a building material is. I prefer to actually get on the ground and examine it. And I have to say, I've added the Lena pillars to my areas that I would like to do an on-site exploration of. Because when you look at this, there's just too many fine details to simply write off as coincidence. Now, do I know exactly what happened? Can I say beyond any shadow of a doubt that I know what the origin of these Lena pillars truly are? No, I don't. But I think it's interesting, and there's far too many coincidences to simply overlook this as a natural rock formation. How much uniformity do you truly need to at least want to go and explore something a little bit closer. And what really is the cultural heritage with it? Is this just an area in Siberia where people go by on riverboats and they say, look, there's the Lena Pillars? We're not actually going to get off, although it does look like the boat tour allows you to get off and explore them a little bit more closely. It's a very intriguing rock formation. And it's more than a coincidence in the fact that there's a vast amount of limestone that they say is in this rock formation. It's also more than a coincidence concerning the uniformity of these so-called pillars, especially when you look at them from the top down. Once again, we see many vertical lines that are very straight. Well, I guess it just flies right in the face of the old saying that God does not build in straight lines. I guess according to scientists, while God may not build in straight lines, natural forces build in very straight lines, and they build in great uniform straight lines, which go along for miles of a river. What else do we know that's along rivers? Oh yeah, they prefer to park cities on rivers for some reason. I guess it has something to do with logistics and transportation and those sort of mentalities that only apply when we're told that they apply. But what do you make of the Lena Pillars? What exactly do you make of this very puzzling rock formation? Let me know in the comments. And as always, I'm open to all perspectives. I'll point out one more coincidence. When you consider the average height of skyscrapers from the 1890s, when we're told that the skyscraper was innovated and implemented, consider what the ideal and usable height of a skyscraper is. And we'll be told that it's anywhere from 300 to 900 feet. Now, we do have taller skyscrapers, such as the Burj Khalifa or Burj Khalifa. Yes, Dr. Davidson, I'm thinking of you. When you see the fact that a lot of this, though, is considered unusable space in these skyscrapers. In fact, the usable height from the skyscrapers just happens to correspond with the height of the Lena Pillars. Now, that's one significant coincidence, I think. Also consider the fact that every single Lena pillar, add that up as a separate coincidence, is the ideal usable height of a skyscraper. And isn't it interesting here that our great forces of authority are telling us that these are considered vanity heights for these skyscrapers? There's a lot of the Burj Khalifa that you can't actually use because it's just too tall, along with many other buildings. Unless, of course, you plan to provide rental space to a group of wasps. And you allow the wasps to build their nests up there, and I'm sure wasps have a good AAA credit rating, and perhaps that's why they built the vanity height on these buildings. So it's quite a coincidence. How many coincidences total do you think there are with the Lena Pillars? Let me know in the comments. Or is it all just a natural formation? The Gornja Shoria megaliths, another natural formation, a rock formation that of course has theories in terms of how it formed. Scientists and geologists will assure us that these are a natural rock formation. Prior to going into this exploration, though, of these so-called megaliths, let's take a look at Baalbek back in Lebanon. Now we know, and the mainstream confirms beyond any shadow of a doubt, that this is an artificial site. The Romans supposedly quarried these incredible stones and built this Temple of Jupiter in Baalbek, Lebanon. And we have verification that this is an artificial site from the mainstream. Well, let's take a look at the megaliths in Gornja Shoria back in Siberia. And when you look on the top, you can see what appears to be a very extensive wall structure. Now I know that's my imagination running wild. We are assured by our mainstream account that this is a natural rock formation. And as you can see, it's another natural rock formation that has a lot of very defined horizontal lines in it. And I'm sure that this is the causes of erosion and that this has been the natural effects that happen all this time. Once again, while God may not build in straight lines, science most certainly can build in straight lines in a natural format. And here you can get an idea for just the size of this rock formation. And it's very impressive that however these megaliths or rocks were formed, that they seem to hold together so well and they have such a structural integrity with them, especially with not just fine horizontal lines, but these ones also have very suspicious vertical lines, or perhaps I should just say very peculiar vertical lines within these very large stones. Now, of course, what the mainstream will tell us is that the very suggestion that these megaliths are artificial is merely a fringe thought. It's always a fringe theory, because they will tell us. Now, while no one in the mainstream actually saw exactly how these formed, you just have to go with your intuition and realize that what you're looking at is a natural formation. It's a very impressive natural formation, and I have to say some of these lines are far more straight and far more precise than anything that we'd see in artificial formations. So perhaps the conclusion we can take from this is that these natural rock formations have to be natural because the vertical and horizontal lines are far more precise than what we'd have in an artificial construction. Once again, this is another site that I would like to get to and explore in person because, as I said earlier, I don't rely on any kind of Feldercarb technology to tell me exactly what the composition of the material is. I would like to verify that for myself. But we can see that the structural strength of these megaliths has to be something beyond what would normal forces be subjected to. And why is that? Because we're told that this natural rock formation has stood the test of time. And of course, we'll be told that it's for millions of years. Millions of years of natural weathering and erosion that forms these very precise and exceptional lines that we see in this formation. Now, you can accept the scientific explanation. You can realize that they have to utilize theories to explain how this formed. And of course, the perception of how they make those theories is certainly not intellectual cheetah flips. I recall having many discussions with geologists in my past life about how many of these rock formations formed, and they always seem to be going back and forth on what the theory is. Well, is it some sort of use of rock? Is it some sort of spheroidal forces? Yes, they'll come up with new words that they seem to innovate on the fly to come up with theories for how these rock formations are truly formed. And I'm not going to go so far as to suggest that this is an artificial formation because I'll let you look at the images and come to your own conclusions. Is it artificial? Is that just a fringe theory? Or is it truly natural as we're told? This is one of many sites in Siberia. We're only really looking at 2 today, and there are many more. There are many more megaliths and there are many more pillars to be seen across Siberia. But if you accept the fact that there might be a possibility that these could be artificially formed, then what sort of force would it have taken to cut and move these blocks? Now we admit that the blocks at Baalbek and Lebanon were cut artificially and moved, but these, of course, were formed by natural processes. And I know I'm emphasizing that quite extensively, but you have to recall that this is exactly what we're told by the mainstream account. They have to emphasize it. They have to come up with theories that they constantly change for how these rocks formed. And that's exactly what they do. So when you look at them and when you consider all of these theories for how these natural rock formations formed, you realize that it feels as though the account is constantly changing. And what does that tell you about the validity of an account if it's constantly changing? And the fact that the mainstream is trying to come up with theories to explain this. It means they do not have an explanation. It means that there could be another explanation for the formation of these megaliths. Now, does this mean that all of society came from Siberia originally? Could be possible. It could also mean that they're the remnants of a previous civilization that existed in Siberia. Now, what kind of civilization would possess the capability to do something like this? To actually cut, form, and move stone of this size? And who knows if this was stone originally, perhaps this was something else. But again, another series of questions and just a lot of theories. There's also many different entrance points that you can't help but realize look artificial. And I find it fascinating that the series of theories oftentimes seems to be revolving from whether it's the work of water, whether it's the work of seismic forces that just happen to form all these very fine vertical and horizontal lines within these stones. And there we have this gentleman again here pointing out these stones again. Well, I've got to say, I'd probably call this guy before I'd call Jeremiah Johnson. I think he'd be a much more trustworthy survivalist guide than Robert Redford if you're stuck out in the Siberian wilderness. It's another thing to consider is just how vast Siberia is, and yet in the middle of it, in these vast lands, you have these extraordinary rock formations. Rock formations that just happen to have very fine vertical and horizontal lines, cut in them by what scientists will tell us are natural forces, whether it's erosion, water, or seismic forces, or some combination of some unique word that you haven't heard before that's been innovated to explain a theory. This is one of my favorite ones here with this little tower Yes, I'm just trying to ponder the natural forces that would have formed a tower of rock like this. It's quite an extraordinary explanation. And then going back to what we saw in Baalbek, you don't see any consistencies, do you? And yes, my sarcasm meter is turned up to 10 once again. Because in the large stones and works of Baalbek, and you'll also see other sites that look like quarries across the land, you just simply can't explain this away by saying there's a rational, natural, scientific explanation for it. I mean, you can, but at some point, are you really just willing to accept whatever you're told because that's easier, as opposed to being naturally inquisitive, which I will say is a natural human trait, to figure out exactly what happened here? Or do you suppress it? Do you just accept what their explanation is, instead of being able to operate in an area of ambiguity or ambivalence towards what the real origin of this is? I do admit that this could be a natural formation. Do I think that's very likely? What I'm seeing does not indicate that it is very likely. That is a lot of coincidence again. Add up the number of coincidences, just like we did with the Lena pillars. How many coincidences do you get for the formation of every straight, vertical, and horizontal line? And then you add up all the coincidences of both these sites together. And keep in mind, we're only looking at 2 sites in Siberia. I assure you there are plenty more that we can explore. Now let's take a look at some of the artifacts within Siberia. We're told by the mainstream that there was a very stunning Bronze Age civilization that was in Siberia. And the artifacts prove it. This is a very interesting figure that I've never quite seen before. And it's an intriguing aspect. Now, could this archaeological... The whole concept of archaeology is intriguing. Now, I can't verify that these artifacts were dug up in Siberia. We're assured that they are, and the research that I did says that these are all artifacts from a Bronze Age civilization. And if they are true, it's very impressive, some of the fine detailing that you have on them. It's also interesting to note that the mainstream does indicate that there was a previous civilization that existed in Siberia. And of course, they'll tell us that it was a Bronze Age civilization. Now, let's recall that the pyramids, we're told by the mainstream, was constructed during the Bronze Age. So if they were to admit that the megaliths that we just looked at earlier were an artificial formation, they'd have to confabulate some sort of elaborate explanation for how they managed to build those megaliths. Perhaps they brought in a lot of water and floated all the stones in place. And they cut them, and people spent generations and generations of cutting the stones. Looking at some of the artifacts, though, you do see some impressive touches. This is a very intriguing creature. And what exactly is this supposed to represent here? Also, the fine workmanship on this, if this is in fact a legitimate artifact. Now you'll ask the question, alright, Aurelian, why are we looking at artifacts that may or may not be legitimate? It's always interesting to consider what the mainstream account tells us, because it seems clear that there are a lot of hints that are given in the mainstream account, and yet at the same time, we're also given conflicting information, conflicting theories. So it feels as though a lot of what we're presented is legitimate, and there is a lot of aspects that we can verify on site. It's one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of on-site explorations. You'll even see that they claim to have found what was a very developed and very interesting warrior. They say this was a woman who was wearing some very elaborate jewelry in this account, and that they dug up this jewelry, and it seems to be that it still fits quite fine to this day. Now, here's a person modeling the jewelry. Does this look like something that some sort of Bronze Age civilization would be able to form and do just like this? Well, I guess if you believe that the pyramids were constructed, as we're told, in a Bronze Age, then yes, anything was really possible. And maybe the question we should be asking is, how exactly far has the capability of humanity fallen since the Bronze Age? But of course, we don't simply accept that explanation on this channel. We look for other explanations and other theories. Now, was this really just a burial? Was this just some random skeleton that they found and looked at the site and then decided to associate that story with this? It's all entirely possible. That's always a thing when you're looking at archaeological sites. Yet some of the workmanship that you see on this seems as though it's beyond the imagination of somebody to contrive in this day and age, because we see a bit more of something that shows a creative inspiration, and something that seems a little bit closer to the genuine human spirit with some of the artwork. So I suspect that a lot of it may be legitimate. Yeah, stone tools that look very advanced. There's almost a modern component to this, especially looking at that dagger. Now, is that just my imagination running wild? If these were tools that were from a previous civilization, what forces have they been subjected to over time? Well, let's look at the most alluring mystery of Siberia. The Tunguska event. Through a fisheye lens, we have an account that a meteor, and I recall the original account being a comet, struck, or didn't strike Siberia, but exploded in the atmosphere above it. It's funny how this account seems to have changed many times over the years, but I know scientists are always exploring and looking at it. This is the exact location in Siberia of where the so-called Tunguska event occurred, back in 1908, so at the start of the 20th century. Now, there's a lot of explanations given for it, and here's the official account. The Tunguska event devastated 770 square miles of forest in Siberia near the Tunguska River on June 30th, 1908. The blast power is estimated to be equal to 30 megatons of TNT. We'll look at that in a second. Knocked down 80 million trees, created a quake that was a 5.0 on the Richter scale. Despite having 1,000 times the energy of an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, no impact crater. The true cause remains a mystery. And this shows the effect of the area. And it also shows the effect of this earthquake that was 5.0 on the Richter scale. Another interesting thing to consider is that the official authorities and the scientists at that time didn't actually get in to look at this until nearly 20 years later. Don't you find that interesting? There are many different accounts on the ground of what the very sparse population saw in Siberia. The sky split in two, fire appeared high and wide over the forest, couldn't bear it, sure it was on fire, then trees were falling, branches were on fire, it became mighty bright, and it's as if there was a second sun. Where have we heard that explanation before or description of such a sight? Now, it's gone back and forth if it actually impacted. We're assured that no object impacted. I recall, when I originally entered academia, that they thought this was a comet, and a comet that exploded in the atmosphere. Well, now they've changed it to a meteor. Now, this is not an actual photo from what happened, it's an interpretation, but something else to be aware of. The event was also observed from Northern Ireland at an observatory, and that was well over 3,500 miles away from Tunguska, and they said that it left a nocturnal glow that you could still read a newspaper at after midnight. So what was really going on here with this Tunguska event? Was this really an exploding meteorite, as we're told? And of course, what the scientific expedition on the ground found was there were trees that were flattened, but they couldn't find an impact crater. So you would think that indicates an airburst detonation. But what if there was an entirely different explanation for this Tunguska event? What if this was some sort of piece of old technology that had been set off at that time? Destructive technology that was designed to level what remained of any civilization to be found within Siberia. Another thing I always find interesting is the strategic importance of Moscow. Going back to the Napoleonic Wars, there's a conflicting account as to what the actual capital of Imperial Russia was. It was Moscow. No, it was St. Petersburg, both cities that we've looked at in explorations. Yet you could say that Moscow is really the gateway to Siberia. What's actually in Siberia that is so critical? Why is it that in historical circles, direct discussion of Siberia seems to be avoided? We're talking about 10% of the entire land. And just to give you an idea of what 30 megatons is, on the right there you see the Tsar Bomba, which is the largest nuclear device ever detonated, and to the left of it Castle Bravo, the largest US nuclear device ever detonated. So 30 megatons is somewhere between those two on the right. What kind of force would that be? And of course we're not questioning the validity of nuclear weapons in this exploration, we're assuming that they are very valid. This is a photo of the Tsar Bomba from the plane that dropped it. Supposedly the shockwave from this 50 megaton bomb circled the entire world 3 times. And of course this was definitely a fear weapon, and it goes along with what we're told is the Russian preference to have the largest anything. So of course it'd be the Tsar Bomba, like the Tsar cannon. One of the things I always wondered though is those Russians could really build a great camera. I mean, imagine the forces that this camera had to be subjected to in the shockwave that circled the entire planet 3 times, or so we're told, the planet. But what was really going on with this Tunguska event? 30 megatons is not too far off from that Tsar Bomba. Yes, it's just over 50% of the yield, but still, that's an incredible detonation. And there's other more modern theories that recently seem to have cropped up that say that this meteorite didn't actually strike anything. It bounced off the atmosphere, and then it just simply went back up into the sky. What a likely story. What kind of device, what kind of natural meteorite just happens to fly down when it's being pulled by the very incredible force of gravity, which scientists assure us exists, and it could just simply bounce off after causing a massive airburst detonation? And here's a depiction of it. Yes, it just flew close to the surface of the Earth and projected some sort of force to level the land, causing a 30 megaton detonation. To be fair, it's an estimate. They say it's 8 to 30 megatons, but on the high side, 30 megatons. What exactly was going on with this Tunguska event? So many anomalies with it, and this is what it looks like today. You still see that there's an area where the trees don't grow. You have to consider, though, that perhaps the on-site accounts were not exactly accurate. But then you consider what happened at the observatory in Ireland, where they say there was an eerie glow that you could read a newspaper at night. What kind of force or device or whatever actually causes that? Where the entire sky was lit up to a glow that illuminated the sky, and they say there was no moon at that time, and there was no natural illumination that would enable that. What was really the intention, or what really happened in Siberia? This just adds to the mystery of this vast tract of land. And when I say that historians tend not to talk about it, there's only some very peripheral historical events that even seem to occur around Siberia. It's not to say that Siberia doesn't have a history. You've got some scattered accounts of various do-gooders from the West who went to Siberia to try to bring healing for people, various doctors and nurses and other missionaries that went through the area. But yet the official history of it always seems to be glossed over for a variety of reasons. And how accurate were these photos? Because remember, the scientific expedition didn't get there until nearly 20 years after the fact. So in conclusion, what do we have in Siberia, and what do I think we have? Well, we look at our 5 eras theory, and we consider where Siberia falls into that, because Siberia seems to be something that indicates a previous civilization. Perhaps we're looking at the remnants of the Tartarian era, or the 4th era, the civilization that preceded ours, that are very clear, especially in the Lena Pillars. Now, could they be much older? Of course they could. But they seem to have a uniformity to them that is very impressive. And imagine if that really was the remnants of a city that was subjected to some terrifying forces. It had to be some sort of extraordinary advanced civilization. And what about the megaliths? Well, perhaps something from the Foundation eras, the earlier eras that we believe that we built subsequent civilizations to include the civilization that preceded ours on top of. And then, of course, you had the Tunguska event that occurred in the contemporary era. Something that was either artificial or a natural event that wiped out, destroyed a lot of what remains, a lot of the evidence. But what do you think of all this? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.